We talk about the Clone Wars quite a bit on this channel, and all things considered, it's a fair bet most of you enjoy the stories this era has to offer. Goes without saying that the Clone Wars were an incredibly convoluted conflict, and it's no secret that the lore surrounding them is confusing at best and self-contradictory at worst. As a result of this, there are a fair few misconceptions about the conflict that have become somewhat common, and today we're going to clarify some of them. In this video, we're going to be looking at a few Clone Wars myths and why they weren't true.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Let's start off with our first misconception, that battle droids were all around terrible soldiers. It's true that B1 battle droids weren't all that intelligent and were markedly inferior to the Republic's clone troopers, but they weren't all out trash. By and large, they filled their niche in the Confederacy's military exactly as they had been intended to. The reason this misconception exists is that people assume the Confederacy wanted their battle droids to be like clone troopers, which is to say highly skilled, mass-producible super soldiers. This wasn't the case at all. On the contrary, the Confederacy specifically wanted an army of cheap, disposable soldiers. At the end of the day, how good a soldier is ultimately depends on what that soldier's purpose is, and the purpose of B1 battle droids was to charge into battle in huge swarms and fill the air with blaster bolts. As we've discussed extensively on this channel, droid soldiers that could outperform organic soldiers would have been prohibitively expensive, and so the Confederacy wanted the next best thing. Soldiers that could be deployed in numbers so massive their inferiority wouldn't matter. This strategy did actually work too. In the Battle of Antar IV, the First Battle of Fallujah, and many others, B1s led the Confederacy to victory through sheer numbers alone. Furthermore, B1s weren't all that trash in combat either. Most Clone Wars era stories make them seem this way because they're usually up against superior opponents, specifically superior opponents with plot armor. When they were up against the soldiers of local PSFs, as they often were, it was a much different story. They weren't the most intelligent or skilled fighters, but they were pretty good at just pointing their blasters in a given direction and shooting without mercy or hesitation, and that's not something to be discounted. Our next myth is that the Clone Wars were largely fought by the clone troopers of the Grand Army of the Republic and CIS Droid Army. It's true that the most conspicuous armies in the Clone Wars were a major part of the conflict, but in reality, a majority of battles were actually fought between local forces without a droid or clone in sight. The Clone Wars, after all, were not a singular cohesive conflict. They were 1,000 small civil wars happening at once across the galaxies. Sectors turned against sectors, systems turned against systems, and while the armies of the Republic and Confederacy frequently intervened in these battles, many were fought without them. In the years before the Clone Wars, peace in the galaxy had largely been maintained by the planetary security forces, 1,000 or so local sector armies with their own war fleets, armies, and orders of battle. When the Republic and the Confederacy adopted larger armies, the PSFs didn't just go away. Those that belonged to loyalist sectors were nationalized and incorporated into the Republic military, while those that belonged to separatist sectors fought alongside the Droid Army. Those belonging to sectors that were split in half by the fighting often split down the middle in turn. Consider the Abrian sector, for example. Formerly, the Abrian sector seceded shortly before the start of the Clone Wars, taking more than 200 agricultural worlds over to the Confederacy. But many Abrian sector worlds chose to remain in the Republic, most notably Rishi. Many skirmishes and smaller battles were likely fought in the Abrian sector due to this division, and many of them would have been between different parts of the Abrian sector defense force. The story was similar for many of the smaller, forgotten battles of the Clone Wars. They were fought between ships of the same make from the same fleets, hastily repainted to reflect their new allegiances. The planetary security forces did most of the fighting during the Clone Wars. They just didn't get the credit for it. Moving back to smaller misconceptions, we have wrist rockets. Anyone who's played Battlefront 2 is likely quite familiar with a rather infamous clone voice line. This line was a nod to the small missiles that B2 super battle droids employed as grenades, of which each droid was armed with 3. These rockets were about as destructive as the thermal detonator clones often carried, and they were used in more or less the same way. In Battlefront 2, they're pretty omnipresent on the battlefield, posing a serious threat to anyone fighting for the Republic. But Battlefront, of course, is a game, and one that takes certain liberties with the lore for the sake of game mechanics. This begs a question. Did super battle droids really use their rockets that much? The answer is no. In reality, it's unclear whether or not most super battle droids even had them. If they were all equipped with small rockets, they didn't use them all that much. Wrist rockets never appeared at all outside of Battlefront 2, meaning they may well have just existed as a game mechanic. If that wasn't the case, then they were likely kept in reserve as a last resort weapon, much like the thermal detonators clones wore on the backs of their belts. This means that no, in fact, clones didn't have to watch those wrist rockets. Now, before someone inevitably comments about this, yes, we're aware of the super battle droids that had missile arms in Republic Commando and the Clone Wars. Those were actually a different model, however, and their missiles weren't the same as the wrist rockets from Battlefront. Those were B2HA heavy super battle droids, and the missiles they fired were much more destructive than those puny wrist rockets would have been. They were the droid equivalent to rocket launchers, not grenades. The next misconception is one that our scriptwriter takes great issue with: the myth that General Grievous was a coward. General Grievous was well known for how many times he retreated in battle, and if all you know of the Clone Wars comes from the movies and TV show, then you might think he was always running away from fights. But as anyone who's delved into the expanded universe a bit more could tell you, this was far from the case. In reality, General Grievous lost very few battles and he killed most of the Jedi he encountered. He was one of the most prolific Jedi hunters of all time, with over 200 dead space wizards to his name. The Republic Holonet News even fearfully branded him the Night Slayer. He was also a hell of a tactician, and while he was no Grand Admiral Thrawn, he had an excellent grasp on cold, hard tactical logic, and was quite effective at combining military assets as well. He crushed the Republic in battle after battle, and it was Grievous that led the Confederacy's greatest offensives at Duro and Coruscant. By the end of the war, Loyalists feared him more than anyone else in the galaxy. This myth arises largely from Star Wars: The Clone Wars, in which he's frequently up against plot-armored opponents like Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's true that he was often forced to retreat in these battles, but retreating isn't the same as cowardice. Commanders that never retreat are headstrong and prideful, not brave, as a lot of the time, a retreat is the smartest move to make. General Grievous was probably still headstrong and prideful, but he did at least know when the best move was to retreat, and this made him a good general, not a coward. The last myth we're going to be discussing today is that the Clone Wars were a stalemate right through to the Battle of Coruscant. Virtually every Clone Wars era story out there makes it look like the war never really leaned toward one side or the other, but if you take a look at the conflict on a larger scale, the story is much different. In fact, there were several points in the Clone Wars at which the Republic or Confederacy was clearly winning. The Republic was actually winning the Clone Wars for about a full year before the Battle of Coruscant, though pretty much nobody recognized this at the time. After the Confederacy's unsuccessful campaigns in the core worlds, Palpatine pushed a series of laws through the Senate that nationalized much of the Republic's industrial might, which was then put to work arming the Republic military. This imperialization of the Republic economy allowed the military to simultaneously defend against Separatist attacks and push back into Separatist space, eventually beginning the Outer Rim sieges. In the Outer Rim sieges, the Republic reconquered thousands of Separatist systems through 6 months of grueling combat, gradually breaking down the CIS. Before then, there were several points during the Clone Wars when the Confederacy was clearly winning. Fairly early in the conflict, the Republic was dealt a brutal series of defeats at Selast, Chipim, Argonar, and Antar 4, defeats that pretty much occurred simultaneously. The CIS proceeded to press its advantage, and the Republic was constantly retreating and abandoning worlds to the Seps right up until the Battle of Praesitlin a month or so later. In the early part of 20 BBY, the Confederacy also had a major advantage which it used to kickstart Operation Dirge's Lance, an all-out assault on the core worlds. In that campaign, General Grievous captured 26 key core worlds and struck fear into the hearts of loyalists across the galaxy, who spent the rest of the war terrified he would come back and give it a second try. So those are 5 Clone Wars myths and why they're not true, but what do you think? Are there other myths you'd like to see us take on? Are there any that we've missed? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comments section below. And just before we go, guys, if you want to hear the music we play in the back of our videos unobstructed, check out our Relax Jack music channel. There's some sick beats there that you can use for your own videos too. And if you want to join our wider community, check us out on our Geetsly's main Discord and our Geetsly's gaming network. And if you want access to some exclusive content and a behind the scenes Discord, consider donating to the Patreon too. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.